for coming. Today I have the pleasure to introduce you to Juan Masullo. He's currently assistant professor of political science at the University of Milan. He's also lead from the University of Leiden in Holland. And he's also a fellow or member of the Amsterdam Conflict Research Network in Europe. And he's a specialist on the things related to international relations, wars, conflict, security, and I thought it was a good thing to bring someone to speak about such topic, even if no one of us work on it. And I also think that Juan does an extremely interesting empirical work, mixing up. He's like the best example I know of someone mixing up all kind of research science and of research instruments, coming both from qualitative and quantitative traditions. Actually, the first time I get to know Juan's work was during his thesis defense, and I was commenting with our colleague that probably it has been the most brilliant thesis defense I have ever had in my life. I was really impressed. So he has published abundantly, and despite the fact that his topic is a very complicated topic to publish in the best journals, there is this perspective in politics article that is forthcoming, comparative political studies. In some, I think that we are really happy to and fortunate to have Juan today with us. And thank you very much for accepting the invitation, Juan. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks, Marta, for such a nice introduction. I'm very happy to be here. I think it's the first time that I'm presenting my work in not only here, but in Madrid in general. So it's great. Today, I'll be talking about the relationship between security or crime and democracy in Latin America. I will be presenting some more existing results from a study that when I say we, is because different parts of what I'm presenting are co-authored, that we already did in Ecuador, which already has results. And then towards the end of my presentation, I will present the research design that we have been working on to extend what we did in Ecuador in other countries in Latin America. Great. So what's the motivation behind studying the relationship between democracy and crime or security? First thing is that if you look across the region, the main response to crime, and when I say crime, you can think of everything from big drug cartels operating in Mexico to important gangs in favelas in Brazil, but also to common crime in safer cities or countries such as Uruguay or Chile, in which you might get robbed on the metro. So crime here is understood not only as highly organized crime, but lately in the world, which is what we see in the United States, which rather than sending the military, although they are doing that as well, is basically giving the police the training and the weapons and the instruments of the military to basic police departments. But we don't see that in Latin America. Basically what we see is they say, you police, get out of the way, now we're sending the tanks. So that's been the most common response to crime in the region. Here you see a map of the degree of militarization of law enforcement in the region. The darker it gets, the more militarized public security is. The only three countries that you see here in white is just because we don't have data for the three. So this means that basically every country in the region has been militarized to some extent, and most of the countries have been militarized pretty much to the maximum level of militarization. If you're interested in how I code these, we can talk about that in the Q&A. What is interesting about militarization is that the evidence of whether this is effective or not at curbing down crime is very, if I want to be generous, it's very mixed. If I don't want to be generous, it has been disastrous. But I need to be a little bit generous because of one guy. who is this guy, Nayib Bukele, in El Salvador. So this El Salvador is a clear example of a highly militarized law enforcement strategy, in which basically, in the face of widespread crime by organized gangs known as maras in El Salvador, Nayib Bukele decided to pretty much send the military and capture as many young people as he finds in the streets, especially if they have tattoos, because the maras usually use tattoos as a membership signal, and send them to prison. And this has been done to a very, very crazy extent. Some people say that around between 2 and 4% of the population has been sent to prison. Of course, this has been done without the due process. It has been done violating every corner or aspect of the rule of law in the country, but it has been effective. So El Salvador moved from being one of the most dangerous countries in the region to being one of the safest in a matter of 3 to 5 years. And it's to a large extent because of Bukele's strategy. And Bukele's strategy also simplifies very well the tension between militarization and democracy. He himself calls himself the coolest dictator on earth. For instance, he's very famous on social media, so he likes this type of things. And he says things such as this: I don't care if they call me a dictator, I'd rather be called a dictator than see Salvadorians killed in the streets. So it's basically, it's openly saying, if I need to breach democracy in order to give you security, I'll do it. And he has been doing it for some years now, and he remains the most popular president in the region. He won re-election in 2024 with almost 90% of the vote. So clearly, Salvadorians are happy with him, and many Latin American leaders are always not making reference to Bukele in order to justify their strategies to combat crime. So if evidence of its being effective is mixed in the sense that it has only worked in one country, what we know is that the evidence of the costs of militarization it's very consistent. So we know that militarization undermines a lot of things. It curtails individual and civil rights, it prevents police reform, it weakens the legal order, it undermines check and balances, it empowers the military and the executive vis-a-vis other branches of power, it damages then the check and balances. So in short, as Melendez, Sanchez, and Vergara say, in short, mano dura policies or militarization do not work very often. They many times backfire, and almost always they entail a very, very high cost for democracy. Still, people in the region love it. If you ask around citizens in Latin America what they think about militarization, the levels of support are extremely high. So here you see levels of support from LAPOP, which is the largest survey project in the region. It covers every region in the country, every country in the region, and it was done every year, every second year. It was sponsored by USAID in most countries, so now many countries do not know how to do it because USAID is not there anymore. But then in the last few waves, they have been including this question: the armed forces should combat crime and violence, meaning the military should be instead of the police, and support for this is extremely high. So even if you look at the safest countries in the region, Uruguay and Chile, at least half or more than half of the population would say yes, the military should be taking care of this. If you go to some of the most dangerous countries, of course, the percentage increases. So here there's a puzzle. So why is that the population is so supportive of a strategy that hasn't been effective in curbing crime and has very high costs for a lot of things, but in particular, or in this case of this research, for democracy? So we can have two general explanations for this. One is that people know that it is bad for democracy, but they are willing to sacrifice long-term democratic stability for short-term security. They are so annoyed with violence, they are so worried about insecurity that they say, okay, if we need to sacrifice democracy in order to get rid of this problem, I'm happy to do. That's one possibility. The other possibility is just that people are not aware of the costs of democracy. Of course, leaders are not saying openly, perhaps Bukele being the only exception, they are not saying, I will militarize security. I know that this might damage our democracy, but it will bring security. It's not in public discourse. So it's likely to think that it is, that part of the story is that people are not aware of it. So my intuition, or my hopeful, wishful thinking intuition, is that this is part of the story. But we then tried to test it out, whether what explains this is lack of awareness. So basically, in this study in Ecuador, and in the study that we will be running in 4 other countries, we are trying to see whether creating or increasing awareness of the potential democratic costs of militarization reduces support for it. And our hypothesis is, yes, it should reduce support. So if you tell people that this thing might affect our democracies, they will reduce support. We focus here on 2 aspects in this study, on 2 dimensions of democracy: undermining the rule of law or leading to the excessive concentration of power. But you could do it on other dimensions of democracy. We chose these 2 because these are the 2 that are more logically linked to militarization. I could have done it with, I don't know, elections, but it would be a very extreme case in which, because of militarization, a country is not running elections anymore. So these 2 are the more credible dimensions of democracy that might be affected by militarization. So that's why we focus on that, and we expect a reduction. However, we expect that if we tell people both things at the same time, that this might be bad for democracy, bad for any of these 2 dimensions of democracy, but that it has been effective elsewhere in the short run. We expect that this reduction, or knowing that it can be effective, will offset the reduction effects of awareness. So we tested these 3 hypotheses in Ecuador. I want to say a little bit why Ecuador, mainly because it's not the let's say, the typical country that you would expect that someone that studies these type of things would study. It's not Colombia, it's not Brazil, it's not the ones that are in the media, but Ecuador is a very interesting case because it was, for many years, and that's why people would not expect us to study Ecuador, it was known as an island of peace. Why? Because it's between Colombia and Peru, which have been engaged in very long civil wars for many years. It is in the middle of these 2 countries that are the 2 main producers and exporters of cocaine. So also between 2 countries that have had some of the biggest drug cartels in the world for the last 50 years. And for many years, it remained completely peaceful. And it's been a puzzle for people that study the region, how come? But this changed dramatically and sadly for them. And it became, or it is today, one of the deadliest countries in the region. So here we are studying a country that it is seeing this security threat almost suddenly after having lived under decent levels of security for many years. So that makes the case interesting. So in the last decade, the homicide rate in Ecuador increased in 500%. Last year, it reached a new record high of 50 per 100,000 inhabitants, meaning the 2nd highest, if not the highest, homicide rate in the region. Between 2021 and 2023, it experienced prison massacres that killed almost 500 inmates. Guayaquil, which is the port city of the country, is among the 5 most dangerous cities in the world. And basically it became home of not only local drug organizations, but also international drug organizations. So the Jalisco cartel from Mexico is there, the Albanian mafia is there, groups operating in Colombia are also controlling drug trade in Guayaquil and in other places in the country. So it became really the epicenter, one of the epicenters of drug trafficking in the world, and with that, one of the most dangerous countries. So what has been the government response? Given the introduction to this talk, you should expect the answer. It's been the militarization. So this picture was taken in the streets of Quito, the capital city. Now, instead of seeing small Fiat Panda patrolling the streets by the police. What you see is this type of tanks, which are heavily armed, and the people that would walk these streets would be the military, dressed as military with the weapons of the military, etc., etc. And the defense minister is open about it. He says they, meaning the drug cartels or drug organizations, they thought that they could subjugate an entire country, but they forgot that the army is trained for war. I think these words are very important because part of the problem with militarization and democracy is that when you militarize, you think of criminals as enemies, and therefore you think that you're waging a war, and this has implications even for the application of the international humanitarian law. So they designated 22 groups as criminal groups as terrorist organizations, meaning that they are allowed to kill them if they capture them. 22,000 soldiers were deployed to the streets to fight crime. There's a semi-permanent curfew and a state of emergency. So basically, a lot of the security decisions are not going now through Congress. They are concentrated in the executive. It was the country by decree was declared in international armed conflict, which again has implications for how you deal with criminals. It constructed 2 maximum security prisons following the model of Bukele. And because it's still a democracy, in 2024, they had a referendum in which basically the current president was asking Ecuadorians, are you okay with me militarizing security and giving more power to me, the executive and the military, in order to fight crime? So that gave us a good opportunity for us to study these topics in a country in which it's being debated at the time. So 2 weeks before the referendum, we fielded a survey with an embedded vignette experiment with 2,200 eligible voters. We had a quota sample in which we tried to mirror the national distribution on the main important variables. We didn't reach some of those quotas, so our sample, and this is important for you to have in mind when thinking about the results, our sample is slightly younger than the national population. It's slightly more urban and it's slightly more educated. In the vignette experiment, we manipulated 2 factors. The first factor is the effectiveness of militarization, basically telling people whether or not telling people that militarization has been effective in the short run. And the second one, we manipulated information about the risks that militarization can pose to for democracy. And as I said, we followed on the rule of law and focused on the rule of law and the balance of powers. So basically, in our survey, every participant read an intro, a very short intro, in which we say on April 21, the government will have a referendum to give a more active role to the military in the fight against organized crime and the maintenance of public security. This is the same language that is used in the referendum, so we are not creating any new language here. So everyone read this, but then Group 2 read a short statement about the effectiveness of this strategy, in which we say giving the military a more active role in public security can help contain violence and restore public order. Then Group 3 and Group 4 read something about the risks that this might entail for democracy. So giving the military a more active role in public security can seriously weaken citizens' legal protections and undermine the rule of law, and something similar for the balance of power, if you want to read it. And then we have 2 groups in which we combine effectiveness and cost of democracy to see whether our intuition that the reduction that we expect disappears when we tell them, okay, it's bad for democracy, but it is good for crime. So this is basically the template for the experiment. If you have questions, we can talk more about that later, but that's the basic logic. And our main outcome, yes?
And did you also, you randomly divided the sample?
Yes.
And on each of them. And did you have also a control group? A group that did not...
So our control group would be this.
Okay.
So our control group only reads the introduction that is telling people there will be.
So this will be group 1.
Yeah, group 1 would be the control group. Yeah, that's good. Thanks for asking because this is here. So control group only reads information that is done for everyone without costs, without information about effectiveness, and then we have these groups that are either about effectiveness or the cost of democracy or a combination of both. Okay, great. So the main outcome question is an attitudinal question in which we ask them how in favor or against they are in using the military to fight against crime. We use the same wording that LaPop uses in order not to invent the wheel here. And it's a 7-point liter scale. And it was fully labeled so people knew what each point meant. Then we have, I don't have it here, but we have a secondary outcome question, which is asking them how they were going to vote for the referendum, whether they were going to vote in favor or against. I will tell you what happened with that question in a second, but the results that I will be presenting are based on this question. So the first thing that we see observationally, so without thinking about the experiment, so either focusing on the control group or focusing on the entire sample, but controlling for the assignment to treatment, we see that the Ecuadorians are extremely supportive of the militarization of security. So we are dealing with a population that it is already very high when it comes to support. So if we see any reduction, it means that we are pulling down people from very, very high levels of support to something lower than that. So in our untreated group, in the control group, 50% chose 7. So the highest level of support, and the average was 6. So we're dealing with a population that is extremely supportive of the militarization of security. This is important to have in mind when it comes to making sense of whatever reduction or no reduction that we find in our experiments. So we had an open question in which we asked them, okay, you told me that you support this, why? Or you told me that you do not support this, why? Can you tell me why? And they had the opportunity to write as much as they want, and we coded those responses. And the 3 main reasons is because people think that militarization is effective. We don't know why, but they think that it is effective, even if we don't have a lot of examples out there that it is. Many people support the militarization because they just think that the police is bad. They think that the police is either corrupt or inefficient, or they just do not trust the police. So if you tell them instead of the police, we have the military, they're happy with that. They think in general that the military is better prepared to fight these type of groups. So these are the reasons. So what about our average treatment effects? So we see that awareness of democratic cost reduces support as we expected, and the reduction is, I would say, important in terms of size. We see a 9 percentage points reduction, and and this reduction is pretty much the same for the rule of law or for the balance of powers. So basically, it doesn't matter which dimension of democracy we're talking about. We see pretty much the same reduction. So for the rule of law, it's slightly lower, but the difference between these two is not statistically significant.
Sorry, 9% is on a scale from 1 to 7? Or?
No, this is rescaled from 1 to 0, from 0 to 1. So, or from 100. So it will be 9 percentage points on the full scale.
So on the absolute value, that's a very tiny effect, or I mean less than 0.5 on a scale from 1 to 7.
So I might have it later, but it's slightly higher than that, but it is.
0.7.
Yeah.
0.7.
I might have it in the appendix. We can look at that in a second. So what happens when we tell them that it's bad for democracy, but that it might have potential benefits in the short run? Our expectation here was that the effect would disappear. What we see is that it does not disappear, but it becomes smaller. So instead of 9 percentage points, we're talking about 5 percentage points. So basically, we see that even when these two are in tension, support decreases. So I guess regardless of the size, this is somehow good news for democracy, at least, or for democratic attitudes. We did a lot of heterogeneous treatment effects analysis. based on, you know, whether people have been victim of crime or not, whether they have high support for the military, whether they think crime or security is the main problem in the country. I have those results in the appendix if you're interested, but basically we do not see any heterogeneity here. So the results are across the board on, even when you think of potential variables that might moderate the effects. So the takeaway from this study is that yes, there's very high level of support for militarization, but at least we want to think about this way. But many times that I have presented this, I get some pushback. We think that this is giving us some relatively good news for democracy, because even in the middle of a dramatic security crisis, we see that information and awareness can shape attitudes, and we are seeing this with a very simple light-weighted experiment. So if we think of scaling this to a large campaign, probably effects will be stronger, or we want to think that way. We have done this rescaled in Mexico with slightly different treatments, and we find the same. So I think evidence that information about the costs of militarization can shape attitudes is there, and it could be a good starting point for larger campaigns. And even if we see that people might not be as ready as we might think when we see the results of elections in the region to sacrifice democratic stability for short-term security. If you look at the last 6 or 7 elections in the region, we have seen one right-winger after another right-winger winning, even in countries such as Chile, the last one. And in part, these guys are campaigning on a security discourse. So basically, the feeling today in the region is that everyone is willing to sacrifice. We seem that our study shows that yes, to some extent, but maybe not as much as the media might tell us. There might be some corners of democratic resilience out there, and it would be interesting to try to tap on them to see if things might change. We also find this in a study in Brazil, in which we see that people might be sacrificing some dimensions of democracy, but not others. They remain committed to democracy, but some aspects they might be willing to put into brackets, but not the entire commitment to democracy. So I guess this is good news. However, we see a reduced support, but as I told you before, we had a second outcome question in which we asked people how they were going to vote for in the referendum, and we see that almost everyone who participated in our survey was going to vote in favor. So one way of reading this is, okay, with these experiments, you can shape a little bit attitudes, but these attitudes are not translating in behavior. I think that's part of the story, but there's also other explanations as to why I think we didn't see any effects on voting intentions for the referendum. We can talk more about that in the Q&A if you are interested, but I openly accept that these changes do not easily translate into behaviors. So, okay, so yeah, I still have 9 minutes. So I want to present the extension, in part because we are at the research design stage. So any comments on this would be, I mean, I'm happy to get comments on everything, but here would be extremely useful because we can still change things. With the experiment in Ecuador, we can't do much. It would be only cosmetic in order how to present the results. But we're doing an extension in which we're trying to measure the trade-offs in a much more direct way and with more nuance. We are designing a conjoint conjoint experiment in which we are forcing people to choose between 2 countries, 2 hypothetical countries, in which we vary 7 attributes. So 4 attributes are about democracy. Here we are exploring 4 dimensions of democracy. The first 2 are the same 2 that we had in Ecuador, or the first 3 are a combination of the 2 that we had in Ecuador, but we are including electoral democracy, which I don't think it's at risk at all with militarization, but a lot of people have asked us, it would be interesting to see it. I think this is an easy test. I think most people will be against accepting that the country will not have elections. So I think that's a very easy test. So we have it there. And then we have 2 measures of insecurity. So in these two hypothetical countries, we will provide people with information about the homicides in that country, but we will also provide them information about robberies, just because the threat of security when the main problem is robberies is different than when the main problem is homicides. And then finally to have, so you might think that people will always be against any trade-off. People want to get all the good things together. So to test whether it is not only about, I don't like trade-offs, but I don't like this trade-off, we are including another dimension, which is unrelated to crime, which is household income, to see whether it is true that this is about security or just about trade-offs. So this is an example of how our two countries look like. I won't read the whole thing, but I think the importance, or what it is perhaps slightly more innovative, is how we operationalize income and robberies. Here we will be presenting a number that of how many people were killed in the country or how many people were robbed in the country based on real numbers of the country, and it has 5 values, and the idea here is to use deviations from the mean up and down, and the logic here is to see, okay, how much democracy people are willing to sacrifice in order to have less homicides, or how much democracy they are willing to sacrifice in order to have less robberies. So it's a more direct way of actually measuring a trade-off. We can, of course, talk about any of these other things. These first attributes are just 3. It will have 3 values, whereas the other 3 will have 5 values. Where we are planning to do this, we want to have variation in how insecure the country is, especially whether it has been a long-standing insecure country versus a newly insecure country. And we also want to have variation in how stable democracy has been in the country. So the countries we are considering now are these 4, which present this variation across these 2 dimensions. But on top of this, they also have interesting variation in terms of the type of security threat that the country is experiencing. So Colombia has a combination of very well organized criminal groups plus insurgencies, and it has a history of civil war. Uruguay has mostly street level crime, and it has let's say, a long story of being against military intervention because of the pacified dictatorship. Mexico has some of the strongest drug cartels in the world today, and Argentina has a mix of petty crime with, in a couple of cities, it's becoming one of the safe havens for some drug traffickers from Colombia or from Ecuador or from Mexico that have moved there, and they started operating there, and they are increasing crime because of that. So the type of how well organized and how badly the threat to the security is also varies across these countries. And I think that's important because maybe I will be happy to sacrifice democracy when the enemy is a super highly organized drug cartel that has transnational networks, but not too much when we have a band of kids that steal cell phones in the street where I live, right? So that variation is also important. So I close with this. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm looking forward to comments and questions and curiosities or whatever you might have.
Thank you very much, Juan. Now I will collect questions. Okay, so we will start this way.